Energy healing is the practice and understanding of using consciousness to affect matter, using consciousness to heal the body, basically. And we know that a lot of times when the body goes off of its natural holistic balance is because something is going on the level of consciousness that's not supporting the highest health in the body. So in a way, it makes sense that by addressing consciousness, we can bring the foundation of balance, the foundation of balance back to the body, back into the field of consciousness, and then back to the body itself physically. All right. So what energy healing is about is like a really nice, direct understanding and empowering you with the ability to go into the experience of it yourself. Because ultimately, it's my belief that each one of us is our own best healer. So, yeah. It's also, I was thinking about all the questions that came in and how, I wish I could take these live webinars to go through it with each person and focus on you, and then focus on you, and then focus on you, and then focus on you, like that, and focus on each person individually. And, because so many of us have little variants in the types of childhood experiences that we had, or the types of stresses that we're carrying in our own physiologies as a result of that now. But I can't. So, and especially the group gets bigger and bigger. So I thought that the better thing to do is to focus the attention on empowering everyone to do that work themselves. Anyway, it's quite a delightful exploration and journey to go into the field of consciousness, your own consciousness, and heal yourself. We'll certainly be focusing on some specific points, though, today, coming up from the questions, for which I'm very grateful. All right, so that's what energy healing is. It's focusing attention in a really intelligent and impactful way to produce specific effects at the material level of the physiology. And it's like non-invasive, and it's essentially free. Once you have the understanding of what you're doing, then you just do it for yourself. You don't need Dorothy or anybody. And anyway, so it's my pleasure. It's a privilege for me to get to be here and to support you on this journey. Thank you for being with me. All right, let's dive in. We're going to have our 3 minutes of silence. I'm going to ask you to close the eyes. When I ask you to open the eyes, do take a minute or so of quiet time to come out of the silence. The silence is an important part of energy healing. It is the foundation, seed, or source from where all this manifest field comes. And it is absolutely the foundation of what we know of as our own consciousness. It really is the platform upon which we understand our minds and our thoughts and our emotions, and all the different subtler aspects of our own inner landscape are all founded upon this first one essential source of creation, eternal, qualityless. So we take a few minutes right here at the beginning, and we just dive into that quiet and enjoy it, kind of soak in it for a few minutes. So I'm going to mute myself, and then I'll turn on my clock. And in the meantime, I appreciate the opportunity to sit in the silence, soak in the silence of being with each of you, with all of you. All right, let's close our eyes. All right. Let's take a minute and then slowly open the eyes. Thank you to the source of creation for being everything, for being each one of us, for being the whole universe. Thank you to that great sacred bridge that connects the unmanifest source of creation to the whole manifest ocean of creation. Thank you for our hour, that we may use this hour in the most powerful, effective, concise, and useful way for every single one of us, every one of you, every one of us, all of us. Thank you for being with me. The laws of nature of an eclipse are that it is a time that is extremely supportive and useful to be soaking in the silence of being. It's a good time to be soaking in the silence of being. So it's also a very good time to be doing energy healing. So good that we are doing that. And the next best thing would be, the best thing would be soaking in the silence of being, just being there. And the next best thing is to be here, soaking in being, but also focusing on healing. Thank you all for having the courage to be with me at this time. I am going to add just a note or two about the current eclipse, even though I'm not a Jyotishi. But one of the things that I picked up about this is that the two eclipses were in the first one, the solar eclipse. The second one is the lunar eclipse that occurs on May 16th. And it's a little bit like a tension and release. You can think of it like a tension and release. In the solar eclipse, it kind of creates the first condition, and then for these 2 weeks until the lunar eclipse, we're processing the condition that's been created, and then the lunar eclipse kind of completes it or finishes it, releases it. And then that sets the tone for the next 6 months, and the next one happens in October. And then it happens again in October. And both the sign that we're in right now and the sign that we will be in October are ruled by Venus. And Venus is, among many things that Venus is, the master of illusion, the master of the relative material field. And the reason I'm even mentioning this is that in our silence, one of the things I was noticing was how the nature of the material field seems more like buzzing and more like dominating a little bit, and how that is like resistance. If you're doing like muscle training, right, and you lift with resistance, you lift with resistance because it supports the growth of the muscles, and the muscle in this case is the stabilization of totality or wholeness in the physical material form. So the resistance creates the opportunity for an even deeper dive and an even more integrated experience coming out of that depth of silence. It's very nice. It's very nice. And it can also be very intense. So I did want to say a word or two about that, just because like that's sort of the energetic environmental influence that we're under at this time during this particular energy healing process. And I appreciate that we're going deep, deep down to heal the illusions or the stresses that are embedded from the distant past. And this is one of the points from yesterday, I think probably one of the most significant, is that the stresses of childhood occur when the individual is forming their sense of self. That's what happens, especially in the early years, especially in the sort of toddler, well, all the early years, really. We're formulating a conception of who we are, of what we are. And the stresses that come in at that time can color that conception. Well, after the conception has been fairly formed, which happens, early, around 7, 8, 9, and then there's new layers of conception that come in. I would say the conception probably goes all the way through the time that the brain is developing, and that goes up till about age 25. But nonetheless, it's a process that builds on its own nature. So the first conceptions of self that come in very early, at like toddler age and little, form the trunk of the tree of sense of self. So this is where we focused most of our healing attention yesterday, was in the trunk of the tree, in those really early experiences and those early levels of one's sense of self. And I went into some depth of explanation as to why almost always energy healing comes back to empowering you with the capacity to autonomously control how you think about yourself, how you define yourself. Ego. It comes back to ego. Because how we self-define determines how well we unfold our full potential. How your potential shows up at the material level of creation is absolutely intimately linked to who you know yourself to be. It is also intimately linked to who you know yourself to be, is also intimately linked to the emotional soup or emotional internal environment that we create for ourselves. Right? If we feel worthy and deserving, right, then there's more of an inclination to create a little bit lighter, brighter internal environment. And if we feel worthless and disposable and not good enough, then that becomes the justification for creating a little rougher internal environment. I'm not saying one is better than the other. I'm saying that the nature of the environment influences the epigenome, which is the environment in which the DNA resides. There is no judgment on the part of the DNA. The DNA doesn't say, oh, the epigenome around me is not good enough. No, it doesn't say that. It's just the DNA is just like, I am the blueprint, I am here, I show up. The environment will bring me to the surface in the way that is divinely inspired, that is divinely intended, something like that. The lighter, brighter environment gives rise to certain types of effects. The darker, bluer environment gives rise to other different types of effects. It's a lot like music. We like to play in both the major keys and the minor keys. They are all good, and they are all evolutionary. And even if you're composing in a major key, you will bring in minor thirds here and there because they add flavor and meaning to the major key. If the major key is just dun dun dun, and that's the whole song, it's like not enough. It's just not enough, and it's not delicious, and it's not amazing. This is as much 2022 is as much a healing for Venus and the parts of ourself that we know of as Venus, the part of our own internal landscape that is Venus. Because The planets are out there uh, at the outer edges of our awareness and perception, because they represent aspects of ourself that are in here and that are important, and that we came into this lifetime choosing intentionally into this lifetime in order to evolve in certain ways. And Venus, she's black and white. Venus has like a checkerboard, right? Like the checkerboard pattern of Bali. They wrap the baby in the cloth that has the checkerboard pattern because the life always has both the lights and the darks. The wisdom of Venus, why Venus is considered one of the great teachers of our zodiac, is because, or of our solar system, you could say, is because she knows how to leverage both the lights and the darks for the sake of evolution. Just letting that be part of what we're looking at here, which kind of, I promised I would go into questions. So it starts to sort of dive us into the questions. And one of the points here that we did not cover from yesterday, and I didn't do much of a review of yesterday, did I? But that was, anyway, a little bit of a review, even though I didn't talk about Venus yesterday. But anyway, yesterday, I talked a little bit about practices for supporting children, some of the dynamics of the important thing that I talked about was how we stabilize or establish our sense of self in early childhood. That was the most important point. And I went into detail of how we use consciousness to appeal to those early moments when the sense of self was forming, and this is worth reviewing too, so that if something got corrupted in the process of developing or evolving sense of self, that can become healed, that we can heal that. So the principle is we work from the astral level of the physiology, and I think I popped a chart up there, but we can think of the astral level as deeper than the personal. We have sort of the dense, superficial level of ourself. You can say your present self, who you are right now. And that includes your physical body, mental, emotional, etheric, those levels. Then there's more like the eternal level of the self, or the self that is unconstrained by space and time, that moves freely through the field of this universe. And consciousness, as we know, does that. Our consciousness does that all the time. If you have a loved one on the other side of the world, it takes 0 seconds for your love to get from here to there. Doesn't matter if they're close or if they're far. Doesn't matter if they're on the other side of the universe. The love goes from here to there instantly. Consciousness moves at infinite speed. It's at that level of consciousness where it is moving at infinite speed and it is unconstrained by space and time, that awareness moves back through time and isolates out those moments where the little tiny toddler self or the little infant self or the little even in utero self. There were questions about what do you do if there were mama was stressed out while she was bearing me. Good question. So even to that self, we can send our awareness back into those areas of our life experience and heal. Essentially what we do is awareness is the instrument of totality moving, that we use it. It's the instrument of totality that we use, and we go bzzzt, we focus it. We focus it here, we focus it there. The great tool of energy healing, awareness. And it brings wherever it goes the essential nature of the source of creation, which is wholeness or totality. So if mama, for example, in utero, when you were in utero and mama was not happy at all about the whole thing, I mean, I have clients whose mamas were trying to get away from abusive husbands during that, and the husbands, rough stuff, not your fault, but just the way the reality showed up at that time. You being there to help her through her difficulties, even though, and it's not uncommon, that the one who comes to help This is the illusion. This is the illusion of Venus. This is why a lot of what we're doing today is a healing for Venus, because we're going to that larger level of self-definition, right? We define ourselves, oh, I'm this small human with this small human body. Yes, well, you are also the whole universe with universal cosmic bodies. And all the planets are there as part of our world because they're really part of us. This is the kind of illusion that comes up when Venus doesn't feel happy. The little soul comes to help Mama overcome her boundaries and limitations, the boundaries and limitations that make her feel that her world is unfair and that her life isn't worth living and that things aren't okay. And she gets pregnant and then she's like, well, things aren't okay because I'm pregnant. When the pregnancy itself is the saving grace. That's the illusion. There are illusions like that. There are illusions. It just depends on where Venus is placed in your chart, where you're going to see those types of illusions crop up. And it's not to say that the material world is not real, even though I use the word illusion. But it is to say that there are ways that the material world, that the material expression winds its way up to the surface that covers up truth, covers up absolute truth, your essential truth, divine truth. And one of the main principles of energy healing is that we are referring our awareness back, whatever moves we make. Like say you go and you send the awareness back in time to when you were in utero and your mama wasn't a happy mama. And then the job is to fortify the flow of awareness into the source of creation. So the awareness is anchored, is ever connected to being or the source of creation, the absolute truth. The absolute truth is you came here to help your mama, even whether your mama was going through troubles when she was bearing you or not. Some of you she was, some of you she wasn't. And all of you, she was, at least going through being pregnant, which, is an adventure in itself. A magical adventure. Awareness goes back. The thing about being a little tiny infant person inside mama's tummy is that there is a tremendous amount of flexibility regarding the degree of integration with the physiology. Think of it like a house that's under construction. You don't move into the house until it's done being constructed. The full construction, that means all the parts and bits and pieces in place, doesn't happen until, I believe it's around 2 months to 3 months, 2 to 3 months, somewhere in there. And according to Ayurvedic science, the soul hasn't officially come to even spend any time in the body much until the mother feels the baby moving inside. That's the indication that, yes, the soul is definitely here now. And even then, I can say from the differences of the 3 pregnancies that I brought to term, the soul has, depending on its nature, has different degrees of investment in hanging out in the body. Some souls will come and hang out a lot, and some souls won't hang out so much. But there's certainly a great degree of flexibility in there. It's like the portal is open, the door is open. And the soul comes, it's like your house is under construction, so you go and you check out how the construction guys are doing. It's like, oh, did they get all the plumbing in the right place? And did they get everything where it's supposed to be? Something like that. So if mama was having her issues, to a certain degree, the placenta protected you. That's its job. So that certain elements of her discomfort are not translated to the child and do not become integrated into the child's physiology when it's under construction. You have some freedom. You have a lot of freedom. Yourself, that's like half, 1 foot in the spirit world and 1 foot in this world, during the in utero time, is able to work with your higher self now very efficiently. You're able to work with yourself back then, and yourself back then is able to work with you now. Like there's a very nice sort of fluid coordination of what you were doing on the level of consciousness then and what you are doing on the level of consciousness now. So just by intending to go back and to support in whatever way is in the highest and best interest of all, of the intention of the true, with a big capital T, the big true intention of the Creator. That's what's happening. It's you, it's like having two eyes open. You, like partly in the spirit world and you in the present, are working together with the circumstances of your gestation to bring truth with a capital T to bear upon the construction of the physiology. I see it coming to bear, not only on the construction of the physiology, but on the construction of the life blueprint as well, which is one of the things that the soul is engaged with during the gestation period. They've chosen, they know what kind of mama and daddy, they know what kind of home life they're coming into. And so their job is then to align as much as possible with divine intention, with wholeness, totality. An expression that reflects the life-supporting nature of being in this reality, in this material reality. That's all. It's simple. It's simple. But it's like anything you try to do, like say typing on your keyboard. If you type with one hand only, you can be so efficient. But if you bring up two hands, it works better. If you try to look at a beautiful scenery with one eye open, it's nice. But if you do it with both eyes, you get a more in-depth view. So what we're doing in this part of the energy healing process is bringing together the soul in the spirit world with the soul in the present, the God, the presence of the divine in you now, with the presence of the divine with you back then, to support your ability to construct the physiology during gestation and the life blueprint in a way that brings the highest glory and honor to the intentions of being, of the one source of creation that created this whole situation, that created us. There's a lot of compassion flowing in this process. I'm looking at it. I mean, it's just so absolutely flabbergasted. It's like this big flabbergasting, I say. Boy, that really dates me, doesn't it? So yeah, and of course it has to do with timelines and how the one shows up. It fractures or it splinters as it enters the field of space-time. And that brings me to another question the lady who asked, I think she asked it about in utero, was, great question. When is that earliest point in the history of the soul where one realizes that one is separate? That because she was thinking, she was going back. I love it. And by the way, maybe I should read a little bit her question anyways, because it was so awesome. And what I admire so much about this question is that she's been with me, as many of you, for many, many webinars, many live webinars. So is actually, digging in and kind of experiencing some of the energy healing process. Here she goes. She says, sometimes when I have a problem, I sit quietly and try to find the seed of the problem. Good job. I recommend whoops. Sorry, it's not exactly a stable setup here. Yeah, so sometimes, where is she? When she has a problem, she sits quietly and tries to find the seed of the problem. A very good practice. I recommend for everybody. I keep asking things like why and where did it come from, etc., until I find some seed or origin point. You can do this too. Everybody can do this. We can do this. It's not a dangerous process. It's a healthy process that's something that you do just within yourself, so you're in your own safe space, right? Sometimes it is in this life, sometimes other lives, and several times I've experienced that the answer is that the origin of the problem starts at the beginning, where I started my own timeline, where there's some point where I individuated, became singular. And at that point, I perceived myself as having broken away from God or wholeness, and was therefore less than or intrinsically flawed. How many people have had an experience like that? Like there's this point inside where I feel like, oh, I'm not with the divine anymore, and so like I feel like I'm like messed up or broken or something, right? Yes. This experience or thought seems to happen a lot when I'm exploring childhood issues, along the lines of, why the heck would I have chosen to put myself through something like that? And it seems to be that I wanted to experience the micro breaking away from the wholeness. Right, because wholeness is already doing that, right? Wholeness is rising up in these waves of self-expression, and it hits where the laws of nature of space and time come in, and then it just like fractures. It's the most beautiful thing. It's beautiful when it does that. Going from heaven to earth in this lifetime to heal the original macro Maya of breaking away from God. And I think that might be at the root of a lot, if not all, suffering. Hello, yes. And she just so nailed that down. So thank you. You nailed that down so perfectly. That we all perceive ourselves as separate from God and not completely united. So our question is, can we do a healing for that? Absolutely. And the point that I made yesterday about that, there was a point. There was a point from yesterday, but now it just immediately escaped me. But that's okay. That's like nature's way also of just kind of keeping us directed, because there's so many different directions we can go with every question. So the point of origin is part of the eternal essential structure of creation, or the point of separation where we like originally feel like individualized. And the way it looks to me is that the one starts out, and as it starts to divide up, the cycle of evolution is like the fundamental form that is behind all the manifest forms, the cycle of evolution. And the cycle of evolution is one. It's like it's complete in itself. It's like 3 in 1. It's that 3 in 1 reality. Some of you Vedic scientists out there are familiar with that concept of the 3 in 1 reality, that it's one, but it's three, but it's really three, but it's really, all three parts are the same thing, like that, back and forth, blah, 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 back and forth, like, along the gap between the unmanifest and the manifest field of creation. And it's one, but as the universe formed, the sense of identity started out as not so many individual senses of identity as we have today, but just a few senses of identity. And these became the structures of our universe. They became the fundamental underlying intelligences that are still present in our universe today as the great cosmic devas, like the 3 aspects of Mother Divine, or different religions define them differently, but there's a kind of 3 in 1 function there. And as the 3 is the 1 divides to 3, then it starts to make more divisions, and the more fundamental divisions become like teachers to the more diversified divisions, or the multitude of other divisions. And every time there is a reflection back to the source of creation. So every time a form is created, that form reflects or refers back to the source of creation like a mirror. And as the process goes on, it becomes more and more like a sort of fractured or splintered mirror, something like that. And so we could say, well, your origin point, where you first thought of yourself as something separate, is all the way back at the 3 in 1. So it's like really far back. Although at that level, the reflection doesn't have very far to go, so it still feels very much like the reflection and the reflector are the same form. But the further and further out the dividing takes place, the more further the reflection has to go to meet back with the source of creation. So it's possible to identify or define many points along that journey that are points of separation or individualization, something like that. And the question is more, which would be an original point where the reflection has trouble identifying with wholeness, right? Where the reflection starts to reflect in such a way that it doesn't feel as if it's really reflecting the wholeness sufficiently. And I think that would be the point there. And I'm just looking back through time too. I kept thinking, oh, I should sit and fathom into this question before the webinar, and I kept thinking I was going to, and I didn't. And now I realize the reason I didn't was because in our webinars, we join our awareness together in a great cosmic flow, great sacred flow, and your light adds to my light, and we have something like a flashlight with many lumens. Many lumen flashlight. So just, I'm digging back into that right there and looking at the form of it. And it definitely seems to happen at the point where the laws of nature of space and time, like that's definitely one of the critical points, where the laws of nature of space and time become active upon the form of the individual. And that seems to, from my perspective, appear to happen between the astral and emotional levels of the physiology. And when we go from individual self, present, remember I mentioned earlier, like your present self, yourself in this lifetime, to the more eternal self. But it includes selves like the planets, includes those parts of self, because the planets also have physiologies that are under the influence of space and time. So it does include aspects of cosmic self, your cosmic nature, your cosmic. There are specific laws of nature associated with the process of diversification. Okay, so an impulse of intelligence comes from the source of creation. It rises up as like a single, like that, the cycle of evolution being kind of like a sort of wholeness. And as soon as the cycle of evolution hits those laws of nature, space-time, it like fractures like that. And but the thing about the fracturing is that the wholeness is not lost, that all the layers still exist. It's just, it depends on where we're looking at it. If we're looking at it from more of a superficial, we see all the fractured pieces. And if awareness is anchored into wholeness, when we're looking, we see, well, there's the wholeness of it, and then there's the way that it morphs into the many, like that. So there's one morphing into many. Anyway, there's specific laws of nature that are present in that particular junction point, where the laws of nature come in. And that's where I tend to identify Manu. I was thinking of doing a live webinar on the laws of nature and Manu. That might be something, you could just write that down, because that's a really, really interesting area that deserves a deeper dive, I think. Anyway, we'll dive just slightly here. Something is lost and something is gained, right? What is gained is the capacity to manifest form at more and more dense levels, like actual physical material dense expression. And that's something important, absolutely. I don't want to use the word essential again, but I'm just saying that the one being, the unmanifest source of creation, it doesn't just want that, it needs it. The one source of creation needs its creation. It needs to create the creation. It needs to create the creation. It doesn't just want to create the creation. There is a driving motivation, internal motivation to create the creation. So that fracturing, it has to happen. But but these laws of nature carry within them certain aspects of the 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 parts that are like not fully comfortable are there to help continue driving the reflection back to the source of creation, back away. So what you have is like this thrust toward the material, and then there's also these laws of nature that pull the awareness back into the source of creation at the same time. So there's a kind of a pushing and pulling energy that's taking place at that point in the astral field. Oh, and it's absolutely connected to that lovely story, which I've referenced in a few past webinars. That was very abstract, so we come to a little more to the concrete story from the Mahabharata of this famous eternal battle that's occurring between the Asuras and the Devas, ongoing. And what they have is they're holding on to the thread like a naga, like a thread, like a river, like a snake, like form, and they're churning the ocean of consciousness. And of course, you can bet that there are snake-like forms at all the layers. There's like one big, and the Akashic record looks like that. It's spiraling. It spirals, and it spirals big, and it spirals small. That's at the astral level, this churning. So that's about the level then that the laws of space-time. And didn't I say it's like kind of the fracturing happens right at the surface of the astral level, right before we get to the emotional level of the physiology. It's very interesting. It's a good question. I mean, there's more, but it's the fact that you're already at this level where you have the intention and willingness to sit if something isn't working for you and work with it and get some nice results as well. It's more about just stabilizing your ability to work in that area. And of course, shining our light together on that area so that it illuminates for all of us. So it becomes a download for everybody in this webinar. So that you know what that area of yourself looks like and how to work with it, how to navigate it, the inner landscape. Okay, here is a lovely man from England asking a question. So here's a man who was born in the middle of a lineup of different children. And so it's like there was a certain degree of not really having the level of attention and affection from parents, because there were younger ones that were more needy, and there were older ones that were more, they got the parents first when there were no other little children around, and are always doing the more interesting things from the parents' perspective, etc. So, and being hit as a little child and so forth. And putting himself into this position of it was better to get negative attention from his mother than to get no attention at all. So the tendency was to act up, right, and to infuriate the mother, because if she got furious with him and caught him and punished him, then at least he was getting her attention. And I'm sure a lot of us have had that experience as well. I mean, most children do that. I had 3 children, and I saw the patterning somewhat there with them as well, and realized that part of my job as the mother was to find ways to expand my attention and my affection so that all 3 children felt thoroughly and completely loved, and did not feel driven or compelled to have to be awful in order to get my attention. But yeah, that patterning, it's just really common. It comes back to some of the work we did yesterday also, in yesterday's healing session, where we talked about how when the child is born, like that's the number one thrust of the child's flow, is to be accepted into the family tribe and to be loved. And I would say, even more so, to know that your own love is valued and appreciated. I mean, it's nice to get love from other people, isn't it? But isn't it even more precious to feel that when you give love, that the love is appreciated? Because then you're feeling the love inside yourself, which is a nice place to be feeling it, right? If it's coming from the outside, it's more like a mirror reflection. But when it's coming from the inside, and the healings we did on behalf of this type of situation from yesterday involved filling in where the fullness from the external environment wasn't present. Especially if a person grew up in a dysfunctional relationship or dysfunctional household, it's very rough. And sometimes a little child, even so little as they are, has to kind of rise up and be like a mommy for themselves. But what you can do is, a little bit like when we were doing that healing with the self in utero, is you can combine your efforts. So you combine the efforts of the present time with the self from the little time. I mean, just the fact that you realized, when he asked this question here, he realized, even when he was that little, that he was acting up because he really wanted her to ultimately catch him. Even though he knew when she caught him, she was going to punish him. But he wanted to be caught because being caught and punished was better than being ignored. And you knew that. The fact that you knew that, the fact that as much of your own light as you have already shined upon those early childhood experiences have awakened for you as a child, that awareness of what you were really doing and what your true essential nature was, and how now what's good is waking up and enlivening other moments as a little child of realizing that you came into this life and you came into a relationship with the particular mother that you had, or for those of you who have challenging relationships with your father, you came to this world to support them. You came to this world to help them. You came to this world as an innocent reflection of the part of themselves that knows who they truly are. Because in our true essential nature, we are that infinite eternal source of creation, folding in on itself and coming to the surface as a human life. And that doesn't have, the value of the life doesn't have anything to do with relative material, at that point, relative material accomplishments. I mean, when a person dies, they can say, well, I certainly made a lot of money for myself in my life, or I certainly, made a lot of enemies, or I made a lot of friends, or I did something, I spent a lot of time transcending, or what I did. But what we did doesn't actually define us. The first definition, and the reason the infant comes in, is that the infant's definition of self is based on pure being, with no motivations and no hidden agendas, and absolutely pure sense of perception of who we are, and sees that in the parent. You awaken it in the parents. You awaken it in the mommy and daddy. When you focus upon them, you value them, you understand them, and you contextualize them within this paradigm of knowing that being is all there is. And it's very evolutionary for the parents, oh my, which is why moms go on and have like so many babies. Like you'd think, the first time I did it, I'm like, Lord, what did I do? But then the recovery period, woof. But then, women go on and have lots of babies. Why? Because then they get to have this wonderful opportunity. It transforms who they know themselves to be. And that's what energy healing is all about. It's about empowering you with the tools to go into that part of you that's your ego, that defines who you are, and being able to redefine it in terms of wholeness. Don't redefine it in terms of anything less than wholeness. If you redefine it in terms of anything less than wholeness, you will get substandard results. Always redefine in terms of wholeness. And that's what the baby gives. And that changes the mommy and daddy permanently and forever. And that is your gift to them. And that's what's important, was the love you gave to them. So now going back to this difficult as a little child, this is the part of your own being that heals the part that was like, well, I need to act up so that I get some attention from mom and dad. And that's a pattern, and that becomes part of my personality, my nature, and who I think myself to be. No, the important thing that you did was you came into this world and you taught them as their teacher, as an infant, as their teacher, that not only is their divine nature, wholeness or totality, that infinite eternal field that exists beyond all manifestation, but they have a doorway to unlock that understanding. They have a key to unlock that understanding. Your existence in creation becomes the very key that unlocks that understanding. Why do parents protect their children? Who wants to get rid of that key? You need that key. Keep that key. Here's another question. I feel that I'm engaged in a profound process of self-activated healing. Good. Of severe wounds experienced in childhood. And she says her 2 adult sons also seem to be trying to heal the same wounds. And long-standing pattern in the family line, so it's a transgenerational stress. And other people also have asked very intelligently about healing, not only going backward and going forward. So there were several questions that came up from several people about this same healings that we're doing for ourselves, and how do they translate to doing healings for our children, doing healings for our ancestors. There's some interface with the epigenome in this process. First of all, let's just go to the source or key of it. The key is self-definition. Redefinition of the ego. That's the key. That comes down to the key in literally every healing. As you redefine, the heart of a mother and her child are so intimately connected that whatever spiritual growth or evolution you experience, you automatically send that to it automatically goes to the children. And vice versa. And if you're a child and you undergo some big healing process, it automatically goes to the ancestors. So they are included. But they're included through the resonations within the physical body. This is so interesting because this is where having a physical body comes in really handy. This is something we talked about quite extensively yesterday, so you can go back to yesterday's if you want more detail. But the internal emotional context in which we reside, colors or flavors, the electromagnetic spectrum around the DNA, otherwise known as the epigenome. And the electromagnetic spectrum is set up by different combinations of ionized proteins. So our bodies actually produce and redistribute proteins all over the body. And as they do that, it colors or flavors the emotional space around the DNA. Why? Because the emotional space is understood neurochemically as neuropeptides. It's understood by the body as a neurochemical environment. So there's a nice crossing over between what we experience as souls, as beings in our body emotionally, and the neurochemical makeup of the plasma inside the cells around the DNA that speaks to the DNA and says, you're going to go bald at this age, or you're going to get wrinkles at that age, or you're gonna, whatever. You're going to have this color skin, or that color eyes, or this hard of teeth, or whatever. The connection is in your hands. You own this connection. You have the power over the environment in which the epigenome creates for the DNA. So the next question is, well, how do I restructure my epigenome? Like what do I do? Thy will be done. Thy will be done. Back to the self. Always the template or the blueprint comes directly from the source of creation. The source of creation provides. You need only to be willing to receive. That's all you need to do. You know that the emotional environment that you create inside yourself colors the spectrum, the electromagnetic spectrum. The arrangement of pluses and negatively and positively charged ions in the subcellular plasma. And we give it back to the source of creation. We just give it to being. And just say, being, you decide how this can be shaped a little more like you. A little bit more like the true me, the true self. Right? I don't mean me like Dorothy, right? I just mean like with a big M. The true self with a big S. We give it back and say, okay, something here isn't quite right. And for you, bearing children, we go back to the time that you were bearing your children. Because that's when their epigenomes were structuring, right? You can do that. And you can work with yourself. You can combine like the two eyes open. You, as you were pregnant with one son and with the other son. So 3 eyes open, like, right? And you now shining the light, knowing, because now you know something that you didn't know before. You know that emotional environment, that feeling environment that you create, colored the electromagnetic spectrum of the plasma around the DNA, causing it to show up in specific ways. So much compassion flowing, so much sweetness and love flowing. Because now you've already received the gift of those children. You've already received the transformation in your sense of self, given to you by them. So what are you doing? You're just giving the gift back. You're giving the gift back to them. Energy healing becomes a self-referral process. It becomes a process of consciousness reflecting back on its own nature. And in this case, your son's consciousness reflecting back on their own nature through the instrument of your consciousness. Oh, at that level, consciousness is quite the unified structure, isn't it? Where does one begin and the next one end? Where does that flow of intention for highest evolution begin and end? They chose you for a reason. It was no mistake. I love the way you present. Thank you. You're so sweet. Who's this? Oh, I know who this is. Okay. We get past the platitudes, who I love you, but thank you, and get to the question. Can we do a childhood exercises for our parents as well as ourselves? Well, we just saw the previous lady's sons do that for her, didn't they? They just did that. Their consciousness did that. Their higher self did that. How beautiful. Yes, so absolutely, the parents can. The thing is that changing the epigenome in the present life, in the present self, speaks to the larger environment. And it definitely speaks to the DNA, right? The DNA is the whole story. And then the epigenome says, well, I'm going to cut out these pieces of the story and I'm just going to bring some of them forward. We're going to make an eye cell, right? Or I'm going to just bring some of these pieces forward. We're going to make a tooth cell, something like that. So the epigenome speaks, and it causes your physiology to show up in a way which is optimally healthy for you. And that becomes itself a template for that reflects back to the ancestors. In other words, their evolution continues through the vehicle of our evolution. Their evolution continues through the vehicle of our evolution. There's also energetically, there's like an energy signature for the ancestral archive. You can receive that download right now, that energy signature. So you can find, basically when you're finding the ancestral archive, you're finding your DNA and the epigenome around the DNA, because the epigenome is essentially all that extra material that you inherit from the ancestors, like their beliefs and their feelings about themselves and the spiritual lessons that they're carrying that they may or may not have finished in their lifetime and so forth. Because often spiritual lessons are transgenerational. They start out in one lifetime, somebody trying to figure out, why is there darkness in the world? And they explore it quite a bit in their lifetime, but that ends up going to the next generation, so forth. Those big questions, the bigger questions. The redefinition of self in terms of the fact that what you have, what all your ancestors have in common, did I mention yesterday? Maybe, is that they all successfully connected with a member of the appropriate gender to allow them to become parents. That's what they all have in common. Maybe some marriages worked out better than others and things like that, but the end result is that this is something universally in common, all ancestors. And that experience, that process, is a kind of a mirror reflection of wholeness. Everything in creation is a mirror reflection of wholeness, but that experience of conceiving a child is one of the reflections of wholeness in the creation that has a certain degree of purity in it. It's structured in such a way to reflect totality, completely like a little package, like a package, a complete package, a wholeness in itself. There's a healing that's happening right now. Our webinar collective is reflecting an understanding of truth with a capital T for the sake of our world's collective, to help elevate people's conception of conception, to elevate people's ability to understand the divine nature of the conception process. The whole thing gets so covered up, can get so covered up with excess material from the relative field. I'm just enjoying, though, us working together. It's nice during these live webinars. To be able to leverage the potential of our group session here, it's very nice to be able to do that. I need to keep working quickly through these questions because there are like 7 questions here, and I've still got 2 more questions, 3 more, bunch more questions down here. How can parents raise children instead have a consciousness-based perspective, but are still able to function in practical ways? Obviously, if the parents are, when the parents are living their own lives in a way, right? They're living their own lives in a way where they're honoring the time that they spend transcending and developing their consciousness and spiritual orientation, as well as nice engagement in the material field of creation. So you're exempling for the children that, and you're living it, so you're helping to kind of structure your internal environment, and then that helps resonate out into the field, and that helps, that impacts their epigenetic environment as well, their internal environment. I think Ayurveda probably has lots of suggestions, and that's probably like a whole field. I think that's a big question. So we did cover some of the basics last night, which she listed in point number 2 here, about sleeping close to babies at night and allowing them to retain their personal power, their ability to define themselves. They need to be able to keep that. And also not using love withdrawal as a disciplinary tactic for children, because that can create distortions in their value system. So she says, do you discourage using isolation or timeout? No, but as I mentioned last night, the rules change like continuously. And I mean, I know the lady who asked this question knows that, but yeah, the rules change, through the development of the child's life. And so there are certain times in the life where timeout is a very effective tool, and there are other times when it's not. Both earlier it's not, and later it's not. So yeah, but I mean, one has to really use a lot of discrimination as a parent. It's not just simple. What about physical punishment? I personally, she's like, parents of our generation spare the rod and spoil the child. Yeah, I'm not a fan of physical punishment. I think that resorting to physical punishment is a byproduct of a lack of creativity. I think that if a parent is more both creative and intelligent, but also sensitive to what's actually going on. Like our gentleman from England who said that he would, drive his mother to punishing him physically because at least he could get her attention. If the mom were watching what was going on and really paying attention to what was going on with her little son, she would have realized that what was happening. She would have caught that bad behavior early, grabbed him and said, "Come here. I need to hold you. I just need to hold you. Come here. I love you. You don't need to act out." But she would have had to catch it earlier, The problem is that moms and dads are tired. We talked a lot about that yesterday, about how one is not one's best sometimes when one is raising little children. And so, functioning on just, a few batteries there, not the full complement or whatever. And so parents make mistakes. So if you physically punish your child, what can one do? But if you can find a more creative way to get to select a punishment that targets the specific underlying issue. You want to get back to the underlying issue. You want to look for the underlying issue. And as we've discussed today, if we go back deeper, the deepest underlying issue is that child is at a critical point in their own development where they're redefining their sense of self. And so they need some support at that moment. And that's what they're really asking for. So the trick is, your trick, is to look at what's going on with them, where they're at, and then refer back to the silence of being, and then determine what would be, at least from your perspective, the best reflection of where they're going next, and help them find their way through the bushes, find their way through the undergrowth to that experience of self. And if your parents weren't able to do that for you, you are able to do that for yourself now. Good. So you can go for that. For those of us who lovingly but ignorantly, so some of us put the child, did parenting practices that weren't absolutely perfect. Absolutely, you can go back and place protection. Some of the things we did yesterday, put protection matrices around their cribs or their beds, or go back at critical moments. If there was a moment in your child's history where they were being bothered or exploited by some kind of energy that didn't have their best interests at heart, you can go back to those moments and you can stand firm against that energy. But remember that every energy in creation comes from the source of creation and is returning to the source of creation. So your job isn't to go back with your swords and cannons. The job is to go back and do kind of like the same thing that I just described for the child. You figure out where that form of creation is and how it needs to redefine itself in order to reflect the 100% total life supporting energy of the source of creation better, and support it to do that. It's a slightly different approach, but it has very nice long-term benefits or effects. I recommend. How do we really know and possibly undo what else might have been traumatic in childhood? I think we're kind of flowing on that, so we're going to come to the next one. What happens when a child is torn between mother and father? So and his point here, this is a very interesting point, is that if mother and father were like very stressed, then part of the idea, of course, psychologically, to put the child in a separate bedroom is to protect them from the energies that mother and father are grappling with or dealing with. And it's true that especially when I was a child, and a lot of us who are around my age, our parents smoked and drank alcohol, and the bodies, their physical bodies, off-gassed a lot at night or in the daytime when they were napping. Like, that was a thing that happened. And that air, especially, depending on the opulence in which you lived, if you live in a place where it was kind of small, and there wasn't good breathing space, and sleeping in a tight quarters with mother and father when there's this off-gassing thing going on, that's like a layer of complication on the whole idea of putting the child separate. However, smoking was less of a thing several hundred years ago. I still contend that hundreds of thousands of years of keeping the child near to the mama and daddy ultimately was a good practice and a good move, and is traditional and was there for a reason. Less likely for wolves to come in during the night and eat your baby or whatever. But mother and father kind of represent two major functional aspects of oneself. Like if we're looking at the DNA and the epigenome, for example, mother and father represent different portions of one's own DNA. So, if the mother and father are breaking apart, always this is extremely stressful for the child. Extremely stressful, extremely. And there are all kinds of dynamics that circulate around that, where sometimes if if the one parent gets custody, they'll try to turn the children against the other one, and all kinds of messy, nasty things can happen in that situation, which is very, very traumatizing and very, very difficult on the child. Because, what did I say the last webinar? Europeans, please forgive me if I mispronounce the name of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, but, his statement that the line between good and evil runs down through the center of the heart of every man. And what man will attack his own heart? What person is willing to attack their own heart in order to get rid of the evil part? It's not something that doesn't feel right. But when you have the mommy and daddy separating or getting divorced when you're little, or sometimes in some cases we have like the daddy leaves when even before the baby's born or something, it's as if these two parts of one's own self are not coordinated. They're not working together as a team, but it's like a kind of an internal self-sabotage type of situation that's going on. Children, of course, will choose difficult or dysfunctional childhood experiences, and we've talked about that quite a bit before, for the sake of having to rely upon their own inner resources. So that's the healing comes in the form of self-empowerment to rely upon your own inner healing resources. And in the case of losing parents in various ways, whether through divorce or whether through death, another part of the story is one becomes an instrument for that healing in the collective. For instance, I had a loss in my life of a family member, and what happened as a result was I tended to place myself in relation to other community members to support very, very sweet, noble aspirations in the men who were like siblings around me. They became my brothers. All the men in my community became my brother. And my role, my relationship to them was one of supporting and inspiring their highest, besides their highest sense of self, but also, their highest, most moral, most ethical and high level behaviors that would support the community as a whole from their position. You recreate it in your environment, what the parents were not able to give you. Um, Here's a man who says that his mother struggled with feelings of inadequacy, and then that expressed to the children, and resulted in difficult childhood. And the feeling of inadequacy is rooted in that sense of separation that Our Lady in France mentioned. That feeling of, well, I'm inadequate because I'm not really, I've defined myself as not being an expression of totality. It's like a self-sabotage, right? I've decided that I'm not connected to the source of creation, which, not meaning to be rude, because I know that there's a lot of suffering involved in that particular experience, but frankly, it's laughable. Did I just say that? Because what doesn't come from the source of creation? What part or particle of our reality is not an expression of the source of creation? Even the darkest, dankest, terrifying entities that might frighten a child in the middle of the night also come from the source of creation. Nothing doesn't come from. So for a person to stand up in front of the mobs and say, well, I'm separate from the source of creation, I reject God, or something like that, on some level, you can say it, but you can't be it. Always we're connected to source. And so, again, that your job as a little child person was to help Mama reconnect with that. And you did. She changed from being a young maiden to being a mother. And that changes a change in the sense of self associated with that capacity to create a human life, and that the human life comes into this reality, and you realize, oh, the human life is actually divine expression. As long as the child is alive, that lesson can't be unlearned. Even if the child dies, that lesson can't be unlearned. That lesson can't be unlearned. So yeah, but those feelings of inadequacy are deep-rooted, I see it down into the ancestry. It's very rough. And they're locked in with certain spiritual beliefs as well. And those spiritual beliefs that include, like, that martyrdom is a spiritual act. I mean, of course, we know that certain people, I mentioned Giordano Bruno yesterday. Gosh, I hope I said his name right. Who was martyred because he had the nerve in his lifetime to insist that the planets are going around the sun and the stars in the sky are other suns. Yeah, he did, like, the unthinkable. That was, at that time in history, that was unthinkable, and he paid for that. Oof. But anyway, yeah, so the point is that there are certain types of beliefs or understandings that kind of lock that feeling of inadequacy in, and mostly, I would say most of it, locks in as a justification of feelings that are very, very dark. Remember Solzhenitsyn and the line between good and evil in the heart? Yeah, that lock into this darker feelings that we find inside of ourselves. And those darker feelings, one of the roots of those darker feelings is a law of nature, which is present on our earth at this time in Kali Yuga, in this yuga or this period of time, which is more by nature dark. It locks in inside the heart, and it sits very deep, and so it's usually unnoticed. And then when situations or circumstances rise up to bring that thing up to the surface, it's so danged uncomfortable that people often get caught or gripped by the situations and circumstances, and they miss the point that they're supposed to go in with their awareness into that really, really, really painful, dark peace that's in the heart and bring it to peace, as I described in the question I was answering about standing firm over the bed of your infant child to protect it from severely dark energies. Same premise. Same premise. We bring our awareness, we bring wholeness. Awareness enlivens wholeness. And certain forms in creation have splintered into fractions, little tiny pieces, and sit in the heart of every man. And we each have the freedom and one of our joys as a human being in each human incarnation is to go in and bring peace to that. And I've described that process in many ways in other webinars as well. So I hope you guys catch those, because maybe we can try to upload one, or I can make a video upload or something more, because I need to continue. How do you process anger towards someone without sending them negativity? Good question. Please check out my knowledge base entry on anger. That question is answered. And it's short and sweet, and there's a video to go with it, and there's a healing that activates as you read it. I think that will take care of that question. Because I'm over time already, and I just want to make sure I didn't miss any super important. Okay, here's a mama whose children have, I should take an order, hang on. Is the family usually family members of our soul group that were pre-planned to help us learn our soul's intended lessons? Yes. Is it that the family, usually members of our soul group, were pre-planned to help us learn our lessons? Yeah. The hardest lessons are the emotional ones, because they're the ones that uncover that little piece of darkness in the heart. So these are, if you're experiencing some types of relationship lessons, that's because you're like an advanced player at this point, and you're getting down to the fundamental strokes of the process of not only healing yourself through consciousness and energetically, but also the evolutionary process. Good question. Okay. Can healings today intended her two daughters who have rejected her? I assume your daughters are adults. There is a sacred space. Oh, go to my knowledge base and look up Sacred Gardens of the Heart. There's a sacred space where you have a unique relationship with each of your daughters. And you can find that space within your own heart. And remember what I mentioned earlier, or maybe it was yesterday, that the evolution of the parents and the evolution of the child is so close that when you make your own spiritual evolution, they also change. And when you redefine yourself as something better than what they thought you were, or what they thought you think you are, you redefine yourself and you live that reality, they will feel it and they will come back to you. And also, it doesn't hurt to honor and appreciate the gift that they brought you. We talked about, when we were talking about little infants, bringing this light that shines on the part of you that has the power to redefine yourself. That's what babies do. How would you heal the absence of your birth parents if you were adopted? Souls who choose to be adopted in this lifetime, they choose the parents who adopted them. So the birth parents provide some information, the DNA and some of the epigenomic information around that. And the birth parents, or the actual parents who raise you, they provide most of everything else. And the premise here is that that DNA wanted to be changed. It wanted to be cultivated in an environment that would support its a better, more complete expression of its potential. The DNA wanted to express more its full potential. So it wanted to be raised in an environment that was different from what the birth parents would have provided. The absence of those parents, well, you still have them with you in the form of the DNA itself. And again, you can find your relationship with them within your own heart, in the sacred gardens of the heart. Check out that link. And here's a person asking about childhood illnesses as a relation, as related to like being bullied or feeling rejected as a little child. Yeah, absolutely. Especially the points that he's mentioning, asthma and acid reflux, occur up here in the chest area, and that heart energy center. Basically the fundamental that goes on there is that the heart energy center is dealing with your pure truth, your absolute truth. That's kind of like the focal point or the anchor point for your pure absolute truth. And when there is some kind of disjunct, or there's the correlation between what you know to be, it's so very beautiful from yesterday. Please definitely check that one out from yesterday when I talked about personal knowledge, private knowledge, and common knowledge. It's a very beautiful, and I'm also putting in a link to give you a little bit more insight and understanding into that. And notice that also my interpretation of the role of the missionary is different from the guy who coined the idea and came up with this thing. I see it a little differently. He says that the person who's got the strongest voice, who is able to transform private knowledge into common knowledge, or personal knowledge into common knowledge, is the person who's got the loudest microphone, who has the most money and influence in our society. And he's definitely looking at a very superficial level at this thing. And my take is, it's much more subtle than that. So enjoy going back and checking that out from yesterday. As far as healing for the chest area, definitely look up respiratory system on my knowledge base for the person who has this question. That's going to be very useful with the asthma and give a lot of insights into that. But this whole area is just, it's so important that it's sort of like your touchstone to your essential truth. And the relative material field of creation is kind of constantly pushing at that thing. It's creating resistance so that you become like the ultimate bodybuilder or something like that, right? It's creating resistance for you. And as children, we choose that because we want to create that resistance early and strongly, so it becomes part of our actual nature and definition of who we are. And often children who experience a lot of illness in early life also go on to be extremely spiritual, which is another facet of that process, that redefinition in terms of being rather than redefinition in terms of what I'm accomplishing in the relative. There's so much to be said about all you guys' wonderful questions. But, and I didn't do any of the questions that were in the question answer box, and we're over time. So, so what I'm going to say is, I will go through these and see what I can isolate out. And if I can present some more, I see it's mostly one person. What I can do for you directly. Thank you for being in my live webinar. Thank you for joining me. And I do really appreciate everyone's specific questions. It's very, very important. So I will print out the questions and see how I can come back in and support everyone best way possible. Thank you, everyone, for being with me. Sorry I kept you a little overtime, but boy, what a ride. It was wonderful to be with everybody today. Oh, so sweet to see you. So sweet to see you here. I look forward to seeing you guys all again, I think near the end of May. Thank you. Thank you for being here.